Eleanor Price paused at the edge of Willowbank Road as she spotted Thomas Hale sitting alone on the cold stone bench outside his shed, his shoulders hunched and his hands covering his face. The early evening light caught the faint tremor in his fingers, and for a moment she thought he might be crying. She had seen him around the village for years, always quiet, always composed, but never like this. Unsure whether to approach or walk away, Eleanor took a single cautious step forward. When Thomas finally lifted his head, the look in his eyes stopped her breath loneliness so deep it mirrored her own. In that fragile second, two lives that had run parallel for years finally crossed, and nothing felt accidental. If you saw two people in their 70s meeting for the first time through shared loneliness, would you believe it could become something life-changing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What happens next will challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and second chances. This story will stay with you long after it ends. Eleanor approached the stone bench slowly, each step measured, careful not to intrude on a moment that did not belong to her. The late afternoon breeze brushed gently against her coat, carrying with it the faint scent of damp leaves and distant chimneys. Thomas sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground as though the weight of the world lived somewhere beneath the gravel path. She cleared her throat softly, just enough to announce her presence without startling him. When Thomas looked up, the strain in his eyes softened at the sight of her. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "Didn't expect anyone out here at this hour." "I wasn't expecting to be either," she replied, offering a small, warm smile. "But I saw you sitting alone. Thought I might check if you were all right." Thomas hesitated, the pause long enough to betray a truth he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. "Just needed some air," he said finally. "A long day, that's all." Eleanor nodded, but she didn't move away. There was something in the set of his shoulders, something tired, something deeply human that kept her rooted where she stood. She motioned gently toward the empty space beside him. "May I?" she asked. He nodded once, and she lowered herself onto the bench with a slow, deliberate breath. They sat in silence for a few moments, the quiet between them strangely comforting rather than heavy. Birds called faintly from the hedgerow across the lane, and the soft hum of an evening bus rolled past the nearest stop. Life around them continued, but here, on this old stone bench, time felt briefly suspended. "You know," Eleanor began softly, "I've lived on this lane for 14 years, and yet I don't think we've ever spoken properly." Thomas offered a small, self-conscious smile. "I'm not much of a talker," he admitted. "Not anymore." "That's all right," Eleanor said gently. "Sometimes words aren't what people need." He glanced at her, then really looked hand. She saw gratitude flicker across his expression. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet acknowledgement of being seen. "It's been a difficult week," he said, the phrase carrying more weight than the words suggested. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "Would you like to tell me about it?" Thomas hesitated again, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. "My daughter," he said finally. "We had a conversation. Or rather, she spoke and I listened. Apparently, I'm too much trouble these days. Too forgetful, too slow, to set in my ways." Eleanor's heart tightened. She knew that feeling all too well the way age quietly shifts people's expectations, how roles reverse without permission. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No one should be made to feel like a burden." Thomas let out a hollow laugh, barely audible. "Funny thing is, I've always tried to avoid causing trouble. Worked hard, kept to myself, but somehow growing old has made me inconvenient." Eleanor shook her head gently. "Growing old makes you experienced. It makes you interesting. It gives you stories that younger people couldn't dream of understanding." He looked at her, a fragile warmth flickering through his tired expression. "You really believe that?" "I do," she replied simply. "And I think the world would be kinder if more people believed it too." The wind picked up then, stirring a few leaves across the pavement. Eleanor wrapped her scarf a little tighter while Thomas straightened his coat. It was a simple gesture to people adjusting to the same breeze, but somehow it felt like a shared rhythm being quietly formed. After a few moments, Thomas spoke again softer this time, almost hopeful. "Would you join me for tea sometime? When you're free, I mean." Eleanor smiled, the small, genuine kind that warmed the air around them. "I'd like that," she said. As they stood from the bench, their steps fell naturally into sync along the worn pavement. Neither knew what came next, But for the first time, in a very long time, neither felt entirely alone. Thomas opened his front door the next afternoon with a kind of hesitant expectation he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the morning straightening the small sitting room, wiping dust from the mantel, and arranging to matching cups on the coffee table. Cups he had not used together since long before his divorce. When Eleanor knocked softly at 2 o'clock, he felt a sudden warmth rise in his chest. Eleanor stepped inside with a gentle smile, removing her gloves as she glanced around. The cottage reflected Thomas's quiet, nature-modest furniture, shelves of old books, and a wall lined with neatly restored radios. "It's lovely," she said, her voice warm. "Feels lived in, peaceful." Thomas chuckled softly. "Some people call it cluttered." "Then some people don't appreciate character," she replied, and he couldn't help but smile. They settled onto opposite chairs, the space between them filled with the soft clink of teacups. For a while they spoke about simple things: the weather, the hedgehogs that visited Thomas's garden, the noise from the school down the road. It was ordinary conversation, but it flowed with surprising ease, like a river that had been waiting quietly behind a dam. Eventually, the quiet deepened. Thomas shifted slightly, fingers worrying the rim of his cup. "About yesterday," he began. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I wasn't expecting anyone to see me like that." Eleanor shook her head gently. "Everyone has moments they'd rather keep hidden. What matters is what those moments reveal." She held his gaze with soft certainty. "And what I saw wasn't weakness, Thomas. It was someone human." He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath he had been holding for months. "My daughter and I, things have been strained for a long time. She thinks I've become difficult, hard to manage." He took a small sip of tea, his voice low. "Truth is, I think she's embarrassed by how age has changed me." Eleanor's eyes softened. "My children aren't exactly attentive either. They call on birthdays and holidays, but they don't ask how I'm coping. They assume I'm fine because I've always been steady." She smiled sadly. "Steady doesn't mean unbreakable." Thomas nodded. "Feels like people forget we had whole lives before them. We had dreams. We still do." Eleanor looked down at her hands, turning her wedding band around her finger, a habit she hadn't been able to break even 12 years after her husband passed. "Sometimes I wonder if people lose interest in us because they think our stories are over." Thomas noticed the gesture, his voice softening. "Eleanor, do you feel alone?" She hesitated, then nodded. More than I admit out loud, the room grew still, the kind of stillness that doesn't press but listens. Thomas leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You're not alone today," he said quietly. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. "And neither are you." Something unspoken settled gently between them, a shared understanding that didn't need naming yet. It was the fragile beginning of companionship, born not from necessity but from recognition. When she stood to leave later that afternoon, Thomas walked her to the door. The sky had turned soft and golden, casting a warm hue across the lane. Eleanor slipped her gloves back on, pausing before the step. "Thank you for the tea," she said. "Thank you for the company," Thomas replied. Their eyes lingered, neither rushing to break the moment. There was no confession, no dramatic gestures, two older souls quietly realizing that something had shifted in the space of a single afternoon. As Eleanor walked home, she felt lighter, her steps more certain than they had been in years. And Thomas, standing in the doorway watching her fade into the glow of the evening, felt something he thought he had lost long ago: hope. 2 mornings later, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, stirring porridge that had long gone cold, her eyes fixed on the lane outside. She wasn't waiting for anyone, or at least that's what she told herself, but when she caught sight of Thomas walking slowly past her gate, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed, her heart lifted in a way she hadn't felt in years. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing her coat and stepping outside. "Thomas," she called gently, not wanting to startle him. He turned, surprise warming his expression. "Eleanor, I was just taking a walk. Didn't mean to disturb." "You're not disturbing anything," she said. "If you don't mind the company, I could join you." Thomas's smile grew, modest but sincere. "I'd like that." They began walking toward the churchyard path, the crisp morning air brushing lightly against their cheeks. The sun peeked through scattered clouds, warming the tops of gravestones and casting long shadows across the grass. Eleanor matched her pace to Thomas's, noticing the slight stiffness in his step but choosing not to comment. For a while, They walked in comfortable silence to people sharing space without needing to fill it. Birds fluttered through the hedgerows, their calls echoing through the quiet lane. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. "Do you ever feel," he began slowly, "that life moves on without asking whether you're ready?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "Every day, it seems, especially after I lost my husband. The world felt like it carried on too quickly, and I was still standing in the same place." Thomas nodded. "My divorce. Well, that was decades ago, but somehow the loneliness of it stayed. Even after all these years, I still wonder if it was mostly my fault." Eleanor glanced at him. "What makes you think that?" Thomas sighed. "I wasn't good at expressing how I felt. I thought being quiet and dependable was enough. Turns out people want words, reassurance, presence. I don't think I offered much of that." Eleanor's expression softened. "We all have our ways of loving. Sometimes we give differently, and people misunderstand that." They reached a wooden bench near a patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived the season. Thomas sat down with a small groan, rubbing his knee. Eleanor joined him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I used to write letters to my husband after he passed," she said quietly. "Silly, I know, but it felt like the only way to keep talking to him." "That's not silly," Thomas replied. "That's devotion." Eleanor looked down, her cheeks warming. "I stopped writing a few years ago. Thought it was time to let go. But letting go doesn't always mean healing." Thomas nodded slowly. "No, sometimes it just means hiding the wound better." Their eyes met then, two souls carrying different losses, yet recognizing the same ache. It was the first time either of them had spoken so openly about their inner lives, and it surprised them both how natural it felt. "Do you ever think about starting again?" Eleanor asked softly. "Not just love life in general." Thomas leaned back slightly, his breath visible in the cool air. "I thought those chances were for younger people. But after the other afternoon, I don't know, something felt different, lighter." Eleanor's heart tightened gently at his words. "I felt it too." Neither pushed the moment further, but the truth of it settled between them like something fragile and precious. The possibility of change of something new took root quietly. As they rose from the bench and continued walking, Eleanor realized she wasn't thinking about the past for once. She was thinking about the next morning, and whether Thomas might walk this path again. And Thomas, glancing at her from the corner of his eye, wondered the same thing. Eleanor arrived home from her walk with Thomas, feeling lighter, as though the sun itself had followed her back into the house. She hung her coat on the hook by the stairs and hummed softly an old melody she hadn't thought of in years. But the moment she stepped into the sitting room, the atmosphere shifted. Her daughter Claire sat stiffly on the sofa, arms folded tightly across her chest. "Ma'am," Claire said without warmth, "we need to talk." Eleanor's smile faltered. "I didn't know you were visiting today." "I wouldn't call it a visit," Claire replied. "I'm concerned." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "About what, exactly?" Claire stood and walked toward her, expression stern. "The neighbors have mentioned you've been spending time with that man Thomas Hale, a divorced man, much older, alone. It doesn't look good, ma'am." Eleanor's breath caught. "Claire, Thomas is a kind man, and he's hardly a danger." "That's not the point," Claire snapped. "People talk, and you're vulnerable at your age. I don't want someone taking advantage of you." Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. "I am perfectly capable of choosing the people I spend time with." But Claire's words continued, sharp and relentless. "You live alone, ma'am. You forget things. You're not as steady as you once were. I just want to protect you." Eleanor felt a flush of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She steadied her voice. "Spending a few afternoons with someone isn't dangerous. It's companionship." Claire's expression softened only slightly. "I'm just worried. People can mislead you." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. "I appreciate your concern, but please don't treat me like a child." Claire exhaled sharply, defeated. "Fine, but just be careful." She picked up her handbag, kissed Eleanor's cheek quickly, and left without another word. The door closed, leaving the house painfully quiet. Eleanor stood still for several seconds, the sting of her daughter's words echoing through her chest. She wasn't angry, she was hurt. Hurt that her own independence could be questioned so easily. Hurt that Claire assumed loneliness made her foolish. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked to the lane to clear her thoughts. As she approached the churchyard gate, she spotted Thomas sitting on the bench where they had spoken 2 days earlier. He looked up the moment he sensed her approach, concern instantly crossing his features. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, then sat beside him. "My daughter visited. She's not pleased that we've been spending time together." Thomas's face fell. "I see. And does that trouble you?" "It troubles me that she thinks I'm incapable of making decisions," Eleanor replied, as if growing older means surrendering all sense. Thomas nodded slowly. "My daughter felt similarly yesterday. She came by unexpectedly. Told me I shouldn't be getting involved with anyone. Said it would complicate things." He paused, looking at his hands. "As though happiness is a luxury I no longer deserve." Eleanor's expression softened. "Thomas, I'm sorry. That isn't fair." He shook his head. "I expected it. She's always been protective, but hearing it aloud stung more than I thought." They sat quietly, the rustle of leaves above them, filling the space with a soft, natural rhythm. "Do you think we're being foolish?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Two older people, finding comfort in each other. Thomas turned to her, really seeing her. "No," he said firmly. "I think loneliness is far more foolish." Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I enjoyed our walk." "I did too," Thomas said, his voice warm. "More than I expected." The church bells chimed in the distance, marking the hour. Eleanor stood slowly. "Would you like to join me for another walk tomorrow?" Thomas's smile was gentle, but full of hope. "I would." As Eleanor made her way home, she realized that Claire's disapproval no longer weighed as heavily. Something in Thomas's presence had steadied her, reminding her that companionship was not a weakness. And as Thomas watched her walk away, he felt for the first time in many years that his life might still hold chapters worth turning. The next morning broke with a soft drizzle, the kind that clung gently to window panes and turned the lane into a ribbon of muted silver. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, half wondering if Thomas would still meet her after their difficult conversations about family. She walked toward the churchyard with cautious hope warming her chest. As she approached the bench, she saw him coat damp from the mist, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes lighting gently when he spotted her. He stood immediately, as though her arrival restored something he feared he'd lost overnight. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course I did," Eleanor replied. "Did you doubt it?" "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "Yesterday seemed heavy." Eleanor nodded. It was heavy, but heavy things don't disappear by being avoided. They began walking along the gravel path, raindrops pattering softly against the umbrella Eleanor had brought for both of them. Thomas held the handle, angling it so she remained covered even when the wind shifted. It was a small gesture, but it touched her deeply. After a few minutes, Thomas spoke again. "Can I ask you something? And please know that you can tell me if I'm being too forward." Eleanor looked up at him. "You can ask?" He hesitated, his steps slowing. "Why did you come back today? After your daughter's reaction? After mine?" Eleanor breathed in the cool air, letting it steady her. "Because being with you doesn't feel like a mistake," she said. "And because loneliness shouldn't be the reward for living a long life." Thomas swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. "I feel the same. I haven't felt this connected to anyone in decades." They reached a small wooden shelter beside the church wall. The rain grew steadier, drumming gently on the roof as they stepped inside. Eleanor shook droplets from her shawl. Thomas rubbed his chilled hands together before offering one to her instinctively. She hesitated only for a moment before resting her hand in his, their fingers joining with a familiarity that surprised them both. His voice softened. "Eleanor, may I tell you something I've never said out loud?" She nodded slowly. "I'm listening. When my marriage ended, I told myself I wasn't meant for companionship. I convinced myself my silence pushed everyone away, that I was too late, too old, to set in my ways. I lived with that belief for years." He looked at her gently. "Then you sat with me on that bench." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Thomas, you made me feel seen," he continued. "Not as someone fading, not as an obligation, but as a man who still has something to offer." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes warming. "And you make me feel alive again. Not because I need someone, but because I appreciate someone. There's a difference." Outside the shelter, the rain softened into a mist, the sky gradually lifting. The stillness surrounding them felt intentional, as though the world itself paused to witness the moment. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I don't know what this is becoming," she said softly, "but I know I don't want to walk away from it." Thomas stepped closer. careful, respectful. "I don't want to walk away either." For a long moment, they stood in the quiet shelter, hands intertwined, hearts speaking through a silence that said more than words ever could. They weren't rushing anything. They weren't naming anything too soon. They were simply allowing themselves to be two people discovering something tender at an age the world often dismissed. When they finally stepped back onto the lane, the clouds had parted slightly, letting pale sunlight spill over the pavement. "Tomorrow?" Thomas asked. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, with a smile that reached her eyes. And just like that, a new rhythm settled between them, gentle, honest, and entirely theirs.